In the untamed silence of the American frontier, where only the wind dared speak across vast mountain passes and primal rivers, there lived a man who did not simply survive the wilderness, he mapped its soul. His name was Jim Bridger, and if the West was a wilderness, then he was its whisper, its will, its cartographer in flesh. Grenville Dodge, the grizzled Union general and master of rail and war, once described Bridger not merely as a guide, but as a force of nature itself. "The whole West was mapped in his mind," Dodge said, and in that simple line lies a truth few men in history can claim. Jim Bridger didn't follow trails, he made them. He could feel geography like a hawk feels the wind, sense direction in the dark, with what others called instinct and he called breathing. To many, the West was a savage and unknowable place. To Bridger, it was a living map already burned into his mind, waiting only to be unveiled. To understand his legend, one must return not to his peak, but to the crucible in which he was forged. Born in 1804 in Richmond, Virginia, a town already tasting the turbulence of a nation on the brink of expansion, James Felix Bridger entered a world that was splitting at the seams. He was a child of movement, a son of the soil and compass. By the time he was 8, his family had drifted westward, chasing the mirage of land and opportunity, settling in the unbroken lands of Illinois near the young and pulsing city of St. Louis. Here, in the borderlands between the civilized and the unknown, young Bridger cut his teeth. He learned the weight of work on a farm, the call of the forest in the quiet hours, and the ancient unspoken rhythm of the land. His schooling came not from books, but from the rustle of trees, the dance of a river current, the howl of wind over plains untouched by man. While others sought safety in towns, Bridger's blood beat to the wild drum of the frontier. Then, in 1822, when he was just 18, destiny called, and Bridger answered with both hands. He found it in the pages of a newspaper, an advertisement etched in ink that would become a gateway to myth. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, founded by General William Ashley, sought 100 brave souls to venture deep into the unknown, into the belly of the Rockies, where rivers ran wild and beaver pelts turned men into kings. $200 a year was the offer, but money was never the lure for Bridger. Adventure was his currency, risk his gospel. The promise of an unclaimed horizon, that was enough. And so he joined the Upper Missouri Expedition, a ragged, hardened brotherhood of wanderers and warriors, where names like Hugh Glass, Jim Beckwourth, and Jedediah Smith would be etched beside his in the annals of the impossible. These were not just men, they were myths being written in real time, blades sharpened not just for hunting, but for survival, for vengeance, for staking the very shape of America. The journey upstream began with hope and trade. Powder exchanged for horses with the Arikara, a transaction older than governments. But the wild has no loyalty, and peace is always a brittle thing. That same summer, a trapper in their ranks, Aaron Stevens, chose desire over wisdom, attempting to seduce an Arikara woman. The price for his arrogance was his life. His throat slit in the night, and with it, the Arikara descended in rage upon the camp. The attack came swift and bloody. Flames licked canvas, lead met flesh, arrows sang their ancient war songs. Out of the chaos, Bridger emerged unscathed, not by luck, but by instinct. A talent for survival honed like a knife's edge. 75 men escaped, pulling themselves upstream, battered but unbroken. Retreat would not be the final word. Justice or revenge, depending on the tongue, came next. Joined by Captain Andrew Henry and a battalion of soldiers and Sioux allies, the mountain men returned to the Arikara village and delivered fire. Many were slain, their supplies taken. The frontier did not forgive easily, and Bridger's world was carved in the language of retaliation. It was in these crucibles of blood and survival that the boy named Jim Bridger became something more, something harder, more enduring. He wasn't just a frontiersman. He was becoming a spirit of the West itself, a man who would live not only in the camps of his contemporaries, but in the nightmares of those who underestimated the resolve of the American wild. Among these stories was one that would echo through history not just for its violence, but for its testament to endurance, the mauling of Hugh Glass. In the wilderness, No moment is safe, and disobedience is often fatal. Glass had wandered alone, despite orders, and in the forest's breathless stillness, a grisly sow erupted from the underbrush to protect her cubs. She tore into him, claws, fangs, fury. Glass fired his flintlock, but the bear was no myth to be ended with lead. His body was shredded. His face, his neck, his back, torn and ravaged. His wounds were mortal by any sane measure. And yet, he lived. Carried by his comrades, including a teenage Jim Bridger, Glass was kept alive by threads and cloth, stitched together like a tapestry of stubborn will. But the trail waited for no one. Captain Henry offered coin to anyone willing to stay behind with the dying man. Two stepped forward, John Fitzgerald and young Bridger. But even loyalty has limits. Fear of another Arikara assault caused Fitzgerald to waver. He convinced Bridger to abandon Glass, and together they took his weapons and left him for dead. But the West, like Bridger, does not yield easily. Glass survived, crawled through the mud, the blood, the bitter terrain, and when he returned, vengeance was his only flame. He found Bridger, not with rage, but with a warning: never abandon your own again. And Bridger listened. The lesson would define him, not as a man immune to error, but as one forged by it. Every great legend is stained by choice, and it is what one does after the fire that defines the weight of their myth. Jim Bridger, the mountain man who would chart the edges of the known world, had begun his odyssey, not with glory, but with fire, regret, resolve, and an unbreakable bond to the land that would forever carry his name. The tale of Hugh Glass and the bear stands among the most brutal and revealing chapters of the American frontier, and young Jim Bridger, barely out of adolescence, was there, not as a hero but as a boy standing at the precipice of a lifelong transformation. Glass, a seasoned trapper and a man carved from the sinew of raw defiance, had disobeyed direct orders and gone off alone, foraging for berries near the Grand River. What met him in that lonely thicket was not prey, but fury itself. A mother grizzly, titanic in her maternal rage, protecting two nearby cubs. She attacked with a ferocity born from instinct and ancient terror. Glass managed to fire one round from his Hawken rifle, but it barely slowed the beast. The bear tore into him, shattering bones, stripping flesh, nearly severing his scalp and crushing his chest beneath her weight. When Bridger and the other men heard the commotion and arrived, the bear was already dead. Whether by a second shot or the Group S intervention remains a mystery. But what lay in the mud before them was no longer a man. Glass was mangled, his body more a battlefield than a body. Most believed he would die before sunset. They bandaged his wounds with rags, built a litter, and carried him for days, hoping nature would do what they dared not. But time on the frontier is merciless, and the company soon faced a cruel choice: keep moving or die themselves. Captain Henry offered payment to any men willing to stay and tend to Glass until he died, and could be buried with some measure of dignity. Two men stepped forward: John Fitzgerald, pragmatic and self-serving, and Jim Bridger, young, impressionable, still clinging to the embers of compassion. For a few days, the two watched over Glass, awaiting death. But Glass, despite the odds, refused to expire. Tension grew. Fitzgerald, impatient and anxious about the threat of returning Arikara warriors, urged retreat. Eventually, Fitzgerald convinced Bridger that their lives were at risk, that staying any longer was suicide. Together they left the broken man behind, taking his rifle, his knife, and what little supplies remained. But Hugh Glass would not die. He crawled over 200 miles across hostile terrain, using maggots to clean his wounds, sucking marrow from scavenged bones to stay alive. His survival became legend long before he arrived at Fort Kiowa, bleeding, limping, and unbroken. Bridger, expecting Glass to be a ghost left in the past, was stunned when the man stood before him, flesh and fire very much alive. But what followed was not vengeance. Instead of death, Glass offered Bridger something far more terrifying for a boy of 19, forgiveness and a warning. The words were simple, but they cut deeper than any blade. Don't ever turn your back on your own again. It wasn't wrath Bridger feared. It was the weight of betrayal, and the man he had almost helped bury. That lesson stayed with him forever. 2 years later, in 1824, Bridger would ride headfirst into the unknown once more, but this time as something closer to the man he was meant to become. During one of his fur expeditions deeper into what is now Utah, Bridger split off from his group and traveled by bullboat, one of the crude round vessels made of buffalo hide and will, across an expansive, shimmering body of water he'd never seen before. It stretched out into the horizon, flat and gleaming beneath the sun. Its salinity was so potent it stung the eyes and burned the lips. Bridger tasted the water and came to a bold if mistaken conclusion. He had reached the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't until much later that he realized what he had discovered was not an ocean, but the vast and mysterious Great Salt Lake, a massive inland sea so saline that nothing could survive in it. Though his error became a historical footnote, the significance of the discovery could not be denied. Bridger had become the first known white man to lay eyes on the Great Salt Lake, and with that moment, a new chapter of Western expansion began. Word spread fast. The lake's existence sparked intense interest in the region, and soon trading posts and settlements began to form in its shadow. What was once uncharted wilderness became a hub of economic and cultural exchange. Traders from the north and east came flooding in, Canadian and American alike, drawn by the promise of opportunity in a land now whispered of in taverns and army outposts. Bridger had turned emptiness into possibility, with nothing more than a boat, a taste of salt water, and the courage to drift into the unknown. But even that discovery, remarkable as it was, would pale in comparison to the sheer wonder that awaited him to the north. Somewhere between myth and memory lies the truth of Bridger's journey into the land of fire and stone, where steam whispered from the earth and water leapt into the sky. It was there, in the wilderness that would one day be called Yellowstone, that Bridger found something no man could rightly describe. He was among the first white explorers to lay eyes on its geothermal heart, long before the government marked it on maps, long before preservationists hailed it as sacred. The land was alive, boiling, breathing, bellowing. Geysers erupted with such violence they seemed to scream from the bowels of the world. Pools glowed with unearthly colors. Forests stretched endlessly into silence, broken only by the crack of branches and the echo of beasts. Even for a man who knew the land like scripture, this was something else, something older than names. He returned from Yellowstone transformed, not just as an explorer, but as a storyteller. And though he would later embellish his tales, lacing them with impossible creatures and fantastical visions, the truth at the core was untouchable. Bridger had walked through a realm that defied understanding and had come back to tell the tale. For many, these accounts sounded like fiction, but those who had ridden with Bridger, who had seen his eyes when he spoke of the molten earth and the mountains that breathed, knew better. They knew he was not inventing wonder, he was reliving it. Through bear claws, saltwater mirages, and lands where fire touched the sky, Jim Bridger carved his legend one footstep at a time, not as a conqueror but as a witness to the vast feral poetry of the West. In the high wilderness of what is now southwestern Wyoming, where the Black's Fork of the Green River wound its way through wide valleys and pine-strewn ridges, Jim Bridger, already a living legend of the frontier, carved his next great contribution into the bones of the American West. In 1843, alongside his longtime companion and fellow mountaineer Louis Vasquez, Bridger founded what would become one of the most pivotal outposts of Western migration, Fort Bridger. It was not a fort in the traditional military sense, no stone walls or artillery batteries, but a sanctuary, a trading post built of logs, muscle, and grit, positioned with cunning precision on the Oregon Trail, the lifeline of manifest destiny. To the endless stream of weary migrants making their way westward with dreams of California gold or Oregon farmland, Fort Bridger was nothing short of salvation. The fort served as a halfway altar to the unknown, a place where wagons were repaired, oxen rested, rifles re-oiled, and doubts softened by the measured wisdom of Old Gabe, as Bridger was now affectionately called. The man who had walked with mountain lions and mapped salt lakes from skin boats was now an advisor to families who had never seen a wilderness greater than a county line. They came to him asking about rivers, snows, and savage lands. He answered not with poetry, but precision. He could tell by looking at a wagon whether it would survive the Wasatch. He could taste the air and tell you how far the snows were. In a time when maps were guesses and compasses spun with madness near iron cliffs, Jim Bridger was a living guidepost. But even a man like Bridger could misjudge the West, and the consequences would be tragic. In 1846, a group of 87 emigrants, the Donna Reed Party, passed through Fort Bridger, seeking counsel before continuing west. Eager for a shortcut to California, they inquired about the now infamous Hastings Cutoff, a newly promoted route that promised a quicker passage than the established trails. Bridger, in what many historians see as a grave miscalculation, or perhaps a move motivated by trading interests, endorsed the route, assuring the group that it was level, well-watered, and traversable. He did warn them of a dry stretch ahead, a supposed 40-mile desert. What Bridger didn't know or didn't communicate clearly was that the barren hellscape extended closer to 80 miles, and the so-called shortcut would take them through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert, one of the harshest regions in North America. The Donner Party, trusting his seasoned words, took the route. They paid for it with their lives. Caught by early snows in the Sierra Nevada, their wagons bogged down, their oxen perished, and hope withered into hunger. By the time rescue parties reached them in the spring, more than half were dead, and the survivors had been forced to resort to cannibalism. The name Donner would be forever etched in the dark mythos of the American frontier, and though Bridger was far removed from the tragedy's snowy tomb, the ghost of his advice lingered in the history books. But Bridger, ever the map-maker of mines and mountains, did not retreat from the land he'd lived to master. In 1850, he once again turned his eye to the wild and found a new way forward, literally. During his service as a guide for the Stansbury expedition, a team of elite topographical engineers tasked with surveying the West, Bridger identified a path through south-central Wyoming that would change the future of American travel. This new route bypassed the traditional South Pass and shaved 60 miles off the Oregon Trail. It cut clean through the Continental Divide, and like a knife parting hide, it opened a path of speed and survival in a land where both were rare. This new passage became known as Bridger Pass, and though it bore his name, its impact stretched far beyond one man. Decades later, the same trail would serve the Pony Express, galloping riders bearing news at unmatched speed. It would carry the iron veins of the Union Pacific Railroad, linking coasts in steel unity. And in the 20th century, the pass would be chosen once more, this time by engineers designing the mighty Interstate 80, a ribbon of asphalt that still follows the route Bridger first blazed on foot and horseback. But Bridger's gift to the West did not end with roads. He also gave it alternatives. As gold fever gripped the continent, waves of miners poured into Montana, seeking to ride the riverbeds into sudden wealth. The existing path, the Bozeman Trail, was treacherous, rife with hostile encounters and cutting through sacred Lakota hunting grounds. So in the late 1850s and early 1860s, Jim Bridger carved another artery through the wilderness, the Bridger Trail. Less direct but vastly safer, the trail circumvented the boiling heart of native resistance and gave thousands of prospectors a fighting chance to reach the goldfields alive. While others chased fame in combat, Bridger measured his legacy in miles, in mercy, and in motion. His paths did not merely connect lands, they connected eras. Each route he scouted, each pass he marked, was another stitch in the fabric of a nation sewing itself westward. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Bridger did not seek glory in war or conquest. He sought clarity, to understand the land as it was, and to help others survive it. Fort Bridger, the Salt Lake, Yellowstone, the Pass, the Trail. Each of these places echo not just his name, but his presence, his relentless, wind-bitten, mud-caked, truth-hardened presence. He was not a builder of empires or an architect of manifestos. He was the man who knew the way, and for every soul who crossed into the unknown, that was enough. Before we dive into the final, most human chapters of Jim Bridger's legendary journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below telling us which part of his life struck you the most. Was it the wilderness, the warfare, or the quiet moments of loss and legacy? Your voice helps keep these forgotten frontiers alive. Now, let us return to the fire-lit trails of history and follow Bridger into the twilight of his epic life. In the shadows between rivers and ranges, glory and grief often walk hand in hand. For all the battles Jim Bridger won against time, terrain, and rival tribes, there were those he could not. Those fought in the hushed corners of tents and homes, beside the dying breaths of those he loved. Behind the iron of his legend stood a man weathered not only by nature, but by the cruel churn of fate. Jim Bridger was not just a pioneer of geography, he was a survivor of heartbreak. Throughout his life, Bridger married 3 indigenous women, each from a different tribe. These were not political arrangements or exploitations of the frontier. They were real unions, born of companionship, shared experience, and a mutual understanding of the harsh world they occupied. His first wife, Emma, was of the Flathead Nation, and by all accounts she was both strong and gentle. A mother of 3 and a stalwart presence at Bridger-S side during the earliest years of Fort Bridger-S establishment. Together they endured the early winters, traded with travelers and raised children amid the dust and hope of westward expansion. But the wild takes whom it pleases, and in 1846, fever claimed Emma's life, ripping her from Bridger's world like a page torn from a journal. No rifle or trail wisdom could stop what sickness had already begun. The grief, though private, cut deep. Bridger had buried comrades before, but this was different. This was home, torn apart in silence. Not long after Emma's passing, Bridger married again, this time to a Ute woman whose name has been lost to time, though her story remains etched in sorrow. She too passed young, dying in childbirth just 3 years into their union. Again, Bridger was left to bury more than a partner. He buried the dreams of a future, the sounds of laughter that never filled the cabin, and the promise of peace that always seemed just out of reach. His third and final wife, Mary Washakie, daughter of the legendary Shoshone chief Washakie, brought with her a brief but brilliant chapter of calm. Together they had 2 children, and for a fleeting moment Bridger's life seemed to soften, his evenings filled with stories instead of silence. But fate, unkind and tireless, had more wounds to offer. His children were not spared the chaos of the age. Mary Ann, his daughter, was captured by the Cayuse during the infamous Whitman massacre and, though eventually released, died shortly after from illness, likely weakened by captivity. Felix, Bridger's son, served in the Missouri Artillery during a time when disease killed more men than bullets. He succumbed not to war, but to illness, far from his father's arms. Josephine, another of his daughters, reportedly passed young as well, her life cut short like so many others in the era of grit and graves. Only Virginia Bridger, his youngest daughter, survived her father and lived to care for him in his final years. She, alone, bore the full weight of a legacy forged in silence, hardship, and honor. Through her, the final embers of Bridger's spirit would remain burning beyond his last breath. As the 1850s advanced, Jim Bridger found himself entangled in a very different kind of frontier conflict, not with the natural world or rival fur trappers, but with Brigham Young's Mormon settlers. The Latter-day Saints, fleeing persecution, had settled in the Salt Lake Valley, Bridger's old stomping grounds. What began as polite distance soon turned into mounting tension. Bridger, a man of sharp observation, viewed the growing Mormon theocracy with suspicion. Brigham Young, in turn, viewed Bridger as a threat, an unpredictable element with deep native ties, invaluable knowledge of the land, and a growing influence among travelers. By 1853, this quiet animosity had ignited. The Mormon militia, answering only to Young, not to Washington, issued a warrant for Bridger's arrest, accusing him of illegally trading arms and liquor to native tribes. Whether the charges were based in fact or fiction remains debated, but the political motives were clear. Remove the man, claim the territory. Bridger fled Fort Bridger under the cover of darkness, leaving behind only a cache of alcohol that was promptly destroyed by the Mormons. His post, once a beacon for pioneers, was burned and occupied, renamed, and declared a Mormon fort. But Bridger was not a man who disappeared. He went east, seeking justice from the federal government, appealing directly to President James Buchanan. Washington listened. In 1857, the U.S. government launched the Utah expedition, led by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston. to restore federal authority in Utah Territory. And who better to guide this campaign through hostile terrain and winter wrath than Jim Bridger himself? He joined the military expedition not as a soldier, but as chief of scouts, the same role he had quietly earned across decades of frontier mastery. Among the young men under Johnston's command was a teenage rider, William Frederick Cody, the boy who would become Buffalo Bill. Cody would later credit Bridger as a formative influence, a giant whose tales were as sharp as his instincts and whose stories, whether entirely factual or not, shaped the West's mythology. Though the campaign faced brutal winter conditions and logistical nightmares, it ended without major bloodshed. The Mormons, facing the full weight of federal force, backed down, and the rebellion ended with compromise. Bridger, however, would never reclaim Fort Bridger as it once stood. What had been his sanctuary now belonged to others, but there was no time to mourn what was lost. The final crucibles of Bridger's life were yet to come. In the 1860s, America was unraveling from within, and the West, no longer frontier but battleground, was aflame. The Reynolds expedition of 1859, aimed at mapping the Yellowstone River headwaters, once again brought Bridger into command as the party's primary guide. Though snowfall prevented the group from reaching their ultimate goal, Bridger led them through Jackson Hole and Pierre's Hole, expanding the nation's understanding of the untamed North. But it was in the Bozeman Trail conflict, the spark of Red Cloud's war, that Bridger would face his greatest moral conflict. The trail, slashing directly through the sacred hunting lands of the Lakota Sioux, was a provocation disguised as progress. The U.S. Army, fueled by gold lust in Montana, erected forts along the trail, determined to protect settlers at any cost. Bridger, with his intimate knowledge of the tribes and their customs, warned the military leaders, especially Colonel Henry B. Carrington, commander of the newly built Fort Phil Kearny, that blood would be spilled if the forts remained. The Lakota, under the formidable war chief Red Cloud, would not abide by trespass. His warnings went unheeded. On December 21, 1866, the worst fears came true. Captain William Fetterman, ignoring orders and underestimating Lakota tactics, led 80 men into an ambush. Every single one was killed. Bridger helped retrieve the remains, walking among the carnage of arrogance and misjudgment. It was a grim vindication. The following year, in 1867, during the wagon box fight, Bridger once again played a role in the defense of Fort Phil Kearny. With only a handful of soldiers and new breech-loading rifles, the U.S. forces managed to repel a massive Lakota assault, thanks in part to terrain knowledge and tactics shaped by Bridger himself. But by 1868, the war-weary scout, stricken by arthritis and growing blindness, could feel the end drawing near. He had survived arrows, avalanches, and ambushes. Now the body that had walked through every corner of the Rocky Mountains began to betray him. He returned east, to Westport, Missouri, where his only surviving child, Virginia, cared for him in the twilight of his life. There on a humble farm, the man who once moved with thunder now shuffled slowly, filled with memories that could no longer outrun the years. Yet even in silence, the West still whispered his name. The trails he carved, the forts he built, the mountains he crossed, and the nations he respected, they remembered him. And now so do we. After decades of carving paths through the American wilderness, charting unmarked ranges, naming rivers, guiding soldiers and settlers alike, Jim Bridger finally began to slow. The man who had once been as untamable as the Rocky Mountains he roamed found himself losing to an enemy that no frontier skill could outwit: time. By 1868, Bridger's body had begun to betray the very legacy it had helped shape. He was stricken with rheumatism, plagued by arthritis that made even the most mundane movements agonizing, and worst of all, his eyesight began to fade. The sharp-eyed scout who once navigated blizzards and blind canyons, now losing the very vision that had seen what no other man had. His final trail did not lead to a distant peak or uncharted basin. Instead, it led him back east, to a quieter place far removed from the roar of buffalo or the clash of rifles. He settled in Westport, Missouri, a small rural community on the edge of the ever-expanding American heartland. There, surrounded not by scouts and war chiefs, but by neighbors and farmland, Jim Bridger lived out his remaining years in retreat from the frontier he had once ruled like a storm. It was his only surviving child, Virginia Bridger, who cared for him in his final days. Their daughter, who had seen siblings taken by fever, war, and the chaos of the wild, Virginia stood as the last living ember of a family forged in hardship. She tended to her father not as a legend, but as a man, aging, blind, aching, and often silent in memory. The house became a sanctuary not unlike Fort Bridger in its earliest days, a place of warmth, of quiet resolve, and of stories. And Jim Bridger had stories. Even as his body failed him, his mind remained a vast, untamed territory, alive with visions few could imagine. Visitors who came to pay respect were often treated to his famous tall tales, some of which defied logic, nature, and perhaps even sanity, but all of which were told with the earnest conviction of a man who had seen too much to doubt the impossible. He spoke often of Yellowstone, the strange and fiery land he had wandered through long before the government marked it on maps. But this was no traveler's brochure. Bridger's Yellowstone was a place of marvels and madness, a world where the earth breathed hot steam and time seemed to warp beneath your boots. One of his favorite tales was about a valley of delayed echoes, a canyon so vast, so acoustically perfect, that if you yelled toward its stone face, your voice wouldn't return to you for 6 hours. According to Bridger, he once used it as an alarm clock. Before sleep, he'd shout, "Time to get up," into the valley. And sure enough, at dawn, the echo would come crashing back through the still air to rouse him. Scientific? No. Memorable? Absolutely. He also claimed to have stumbled upon a mountain made entirely of invisible glass. From afar, he saw an elk standing still, defying every instinct, not moving as he fired shot after shot. It wasn't until he approached that he discovered the beast wasn't ignoring him. It was standing on the other side of a massive pane of crystal-clear glass. Each bullet had struck the glass and been flattened or deflected. He said it was clearer than air and harder than sin. And then there was the petrified forest of Yellowstone, where Bridger said he encountered not only fossilized trees, but petrified birds that sang petrified songs. What exactly a petrified song sounded like, he never quite explained, nor did he need to. The image was enough to seed the imagination of anyone listening. In another story, Bridger swore there existed a magical trout lake, cold on the bottom, boiling hot on top, where he could drop a line hook of fish and pull it up so slowly that by the time the fish surfaced, it was already cooked through. A meal caught and prepared in the same motion, courtesy of nature's strange order. To modern ears, these sound like frontier fairy tales, embellished or invented. But to Bridger-esque listeners, many of whom had never seen Yellowstone or the Great Salt Lake or even a mountain, these stories weren't tea lies. They were invitations. Invitations to imagine a world larger than maps and government lines. A world that still had magic in it. And when he finally passed on July 17, 1881, the West grew quieter. A voice that had once echoed from mountaintops and campfires. A man who had lived through empires of dust and rivers of blood simply closed his eyes and was gone. He was buried at first in a small, unmarked grave in Missouri, far from the roaring lands he had known, but his story didn't end there. In 1904, at the request of General Grenville Dodge, Bridger's body was exhumed and reinterred in Mount Washington Cemetery in Independence, Missouri. Dodge, a man of war and railroads, who had once relied on Bridger's unmatched guidance, spoke of him not merely as a scout, but as a pillar of the American spirit. He described Bridger as tall, straight as an arrow, with gray eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. In his later years, he was gentle, generous, and always ready with a tale, even if half of it might have been invented on the spot. But more than anything, he was trusted. And in a time and place where trust could mean the difference between survival and death, that was the highest praise one could earn. Today, Bridger's name lingers across the West like a long echo. Fort Bridger, Bridger Pass, Bridger Teton National Forest, and dozens of mountain peaks and rivers that bear the mark of his memory. But even more than names carved into stone, it's the spirit of exploration, of grit without cruelty, of wisdom without arrogance, that defines what Jim Bridger left behind. He was not a politician, not a general, Not a man of wealth or high education. He was something rarer, a witness to the forming of a nation, a bridge between cultures, and a man who helped others pass not just over rivers, but through moments of fear, doubt, and wildness. Jim Bridger is remembered not because he conquered the West, but because he learned to live with it. And now, if you've made it this far, if you've walked these last miles of his journey with us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video if Bridger's story inspired you, and leave a comment telling us which of his wild tales or real feats moved you the most. Was it the invisible mountain, the echoing valley, or just the quiet way a man could become a legend without ever seeking to be one? Thanks for watching, and may your next trail be just as full of wonder.